All right, so today I am doing another flight lesson, and I'm gonna bring y'all along with me. Not sure how my audio is going to sound, but I'm going to still bring y'all with me, at least give y'all the video of footage of the flight, and we're gonna go from there. So let's get it, let's go. So unfortunately for this video, was not able to get the cockpit audio, but still working through that, and I definitely will look to have that available, as I continue to put out more videos. But of course, as you can see, we begin to take off. Put my heels on the floor, gave the plane full power, made sure all of the instruments was in the green and the airspeed was where it needed to be, and I began to pull back on the yoke. But one thing I made a mistake on was I began to pull back on the yoke sooner than I was supposed to. The goal was to allow the plane to get to about 60 knots on the airspeed indicator, and I believe I started pulling back at about 55 knots. So it was kind of a struggle in the beginning. As I pulled the yoke back, I noticed the plane wasn't, getting any lift, and eventually the plane, of course, got to 60 knots on the airspeed, and then we got lift. But that's something, as we were, climbing, something my instructor immediately, kind of explained to me, what I did wrong and, what happened as a result of that. So, right now we're just climbing to our cruise altitude, which is about 3,500 feet. So once we got to our cruise altitude, the first thing we reviewed was turns to a heading. So basically, we were flying on one heading, let's just say a south heading, and my instructor would, give me the direction to make a right turn to, east heading. And I would make the right turn, to the east heading, making sure I stayed on altitude, making sure that I kept the nose of the plane on the horizon. Because one thing, I'm noticing as I'm flying, I tend to allow the nose of the plane to drop as I'm making that turn, which allows me to, of course, lose altitude. And that's just something that we were kind of reviewing today to ensure that, I was keeping the nose on the horizon, making sure I was looking outside of the plane and not getting caught up on the instruments. So after we completed working on turns to a heading, we then began working on steep turns. So first, my instructor, he gave, a brief demonstration of, steep turn and how it should look, what things I should be looking for in a steep turn and things of that nature. And after he kind of did his steep turn to the left and 360 degrees steep turn to the right, then he allowed me to, take over controls and work on my steep turn. So for me, as I was working on my steep turns, a few things my instructor pointed out to me was, just making sure that I'm looking outside and inside as I'm making that steep turn, because it is a visual maneuver that I'm trying to do. So just making sure that I was staying focused, looking outside and inside on the plane. And also another thing was that he wanted me to make sure that, one thing that I did when I was doing the maneuver, I was kind of anticipating the nose on the plane falling as I kind of got into the turn, and my anticipation caused me to pull back on the yoke a lot more than I should have, causing the plane to begin to climb when we don't want to climb. We wanted to complete the steep turn and stay within that altitude. So just for me, recognizing that it doesn't take large changes as I'm flying the plane, a slight pull back on the yoke and maybe a slight push forward and things of that nature, and not large a large force of pulling back to for me to remain and keep the same altitude as I'm making the turn. And also another thing was, as I was coming out of the turns, just making sure that I used the opposite aileron and opposite rudder in order to stop that turn, in order to get back on heading. So because I believe the standards when I'm taking the check ride would be like I have to be within 10 degrees of the heading and no more than plus or minus 100 feet of altitude when I'm completing a steep turn. So just working on that, making sure I'm coming right back on, snapping back from that turn, using that opposite aileron and opposite rudder, while also remaining on altitude. Okay, so the final thing we worked on was slow flight, and basically the main thing out of slow flight, and kind of what my instructor was kind of reiterating over and over was pitching for airspeed and power for altitude. So whenever the goal was to maintain 70 knots on the airspeed indicator, and whenever I needed to gain altitude, I would apply power. Whenever I would needed to pitch for that airspeed, if I was above 70 knots, then I would pull the yoke back, and if I was below 70, I would push the yoke in. And for me, it was just a constant fight of trying to really stay at that 70 knots of airspeed. So a lot of constant change, a lot of making sure I'm looking out to the horizon, making sure the nose is leveled and things of that nature. So we kind of went over that as we prepared to go to another airport where we stopped to get fuel. And another thing about slow flight, basically the reason we were doing it is basically to prepare us for landing. So, and it made a lot more sense as we were landing at the airport, because I was actually doing the things that we just worked on when it came to slow flight. So it all made sense. It started clicking, once we began the process of landing, and we got into the traffic pattern for landing. It kind of all started clicking, and it made a lot more sense why we were doing what we were doing. So after we got fuel, we prepared to take off, and we were heading back to our home airport. And one thing I can say, from this takeoff, from the first one I did earlier in the day, this one was a lot better. Did a better job staying on the center line. did a great job of, ensuring that waited until we got to 60 knots airspeed in order to take off and pull the yoke back and gain lift. I was definitely pitching for VY, which I think was it's 76 knots precisely on the Piper. So was making sure as we were climbing, pitching for 76 knots. And I did a good job, overall with this takeoff, rather than my first one. So definitely making progress, and that's really what it's all about. Just getting 1% better every time. I got into the plane, and so I was very, very, very excited about that. And one thing, me and my instructor did, we kind of debriefed when we were getting fuel for the plane at the other airport. So as he was as we were debriefing, a lot of the things he was saying were kind of making sense and kind of clicking, which is why debrief is very important, for you to go over things with your instructor, because it's you hear it, of course, when you're in the plane, when you're flying, and you understand, you hear what they're saying, but it's within your first few lessons, it's just so much going on, and you're still trying to get used to learning how to control the plane, realizing what's going on, and what you're actually doing. So it's still it still could be a bit overwhelming at times as a new student pilot, but that's why it's important to have an instructor that does that debrief with you and kind of walks you through thoroughly what you did wrong, and why you're doing what you're doing, and some things you can do to improve. And like I said, as we went over our debrief, as we were getting fuel, he explained to me what happened during my first takeoff, and why it didn't go as smoothly as I would like, and I made the corrections, and he called that out as well. He called out, as we were, as I was doing the things correct, he called it out, and said, hey, that's great, because that means, you're learning. That means you're taking what I'm saying, and you're applying it. So that's definitely always good when it comes to your flight training, and as you progress through. So now, as we were preparing to land at our home airport, this is where the earlier lesson of slow flight definitely came into play, because I was a lot more hands-on with the landing, throughout the traffic pattern, flying in the traffic pattern, making radio calls during this time. And as we came in for landing, just ensuring that I was doing the things that we just worked on, pitching for that 79 airspeed, and making sure the flaps were down, and making sure I was at the right altitude, and when I needed to gain more altitude, I applied power, to get to the altitude. So just using that reference of pitch for airspeed, power for decline reference, as we came into land. And so as we landed the airplane, of course I didn't land the airplane on my own. This was only my fifth lesson, but of course I was hands-on, and my instructor was kind of walking me through what I should be looking for as I'm preparing to land the plane and things of that nature. So of course we landed the plane, got off the runway, cleaned up the aircraft, and we taxied back to the hangar, and we secured the aircraft and put it up. And that pretty much concluded my flight lesson for that day. So I definitely think it was valuable. Like I said, we of course went over the takeoff portion of the flight. We worked on turns to a heading, worked on steep turns, and we also worked on slow flight. So overall, it was a great flight. I felt like I definitely learned something. I felt like I was able to apply things that I learned, and also my instructor gave me some things to look into on the coming days, since I wasn't flying, and prepare for my next lesson, so we could hit the ground running on our next lesson, and we don't have to do so much backtracking on the things we kind of already went over. So overall, great lesson. I made improvement, I had fun, and that's really what it was all about. So before in this video, I do want to give you a breakdown of the total cost of this lesson. So for the airplane rental, I rented the plane for 1.7 hours, which was a total of $221. My instructor fee was $85, and we stopped for fuel, and I got about 11 gallons of fuel, and that total was $52.69 for fuel. So my total cost for this lesson was $358.69. Thank y'all for watching this video. If you want to continue to follow along my journey to become a professional pilot, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. If you like this video, make sure you hit that like button. Also leave a comment, if what you enjoyed about this video, what you want me to discuss for future videos. I'm open to all topics, and I'm transparent throughout this process. So whatever you want to know, please don't hesitate to let me know. And if you would like to support my flight training and my flight journey, go ahead and click that link in the description to purchase you a No Limits Just Horizon t-shirt. I would greatly appreciate it. But I appreciate you for watching this video, and look forward to seeing you next time. Peace and blessings.